June 16, 1943. 4 o'clock in the morning. The jungle air at Port Moresby lay thick and warm over the 7-mile airstrip in New Guinea, that long, battered corridor of dirt and steel mesh that the men of the United States 5th Air Force had carved out of the earth with bare hands and sheer will. The night was without stars. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, something unseen moved through the undergrowth, and the sound of distant surf came in long, unhurried waves off the coral sea. The base was not fully silent. It never was. Even before dawn, engines groaned on the flight line. Propellers turned through test cycles in fits of mechanical coughing, and mechanics worked under guttering lanterns, their hands black with oil, their eyes red from too many sleepless hours. Near the far end of the runway, a single aircraft sat apart from the others. She was not handsome. She bore no elaborate nose art, no proud insignia painted in bright colors along her flanks. Her aluminum skin was creased and riveted with patchwork repairs, and in the pale darkness she resembled less a weapon of war than a very old, very tired piece of machinery. Her tail bore the stencil designation 41 to 2666, and the men who loved her had long since shortened that number into something that followed her like a shadow, Old 666, a Boeing B-17E Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber built in Seattle, Washington in March of 1942, a machine that, by the honest judgment of other pilots, should have long ago been cut apart for scrap. Subscribe to keep these untold stories of moral courage alive. Hit that bell so you never miss when history whispers what textbooks won't say. And yet here she stood, engines idling, her 4 Wright Cyclones rumbling like low thunder. Standing on the flight line beside her, Captain J. Zemer Jr. checked his watch. 24 years old, long-limbed and unhurried in his manner, Zemer had about him the kind of ease that either unsettled people or comforted them greatly, depending on who was watching. He had been awake since midnight, when the phone had rung a second time with a change to his orders, a change he had refused in cold, quiet language, and had only half relented on after hours of internal argument. He reviewed his maps one more time. He reviewed them the way a craftsman reviews his tools before undertaking a job he knows will be complicated. Then he climbed the ladder into the belly of Old 666, settled into the left seat, and put his hands on the controls. Behind him, 9 men took their positions, what none of them fully said aloud that morning, and what the pre-dawn darkness helped to conceal was the simple calculation they had all already made. The mission they were about to fly had been attempted before and had not been accomplished. The target lay more than 600 miles over open ocean, beyond the reach of any friendly aircraft, above one of the most fortified positions in the entire South Pacific. And they were going alone. They were always going alone. The camera in the belly of Old 666 clicked once, softly, as if checking itself. It would be the last quiet sound any of them heard for a very long time. To understand what the crew of Old 666 was asked to do on June 16, 1943, one must understand the larger architecture of the war as it stood in the South Pacific at that moment in history. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the Pacific War had shifted, but only by a narrow, contested margin. Japan had not been broken. She had only been checked. The victories at Midway in June 1942, the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal through late 1942 and into 1943, the catastrophic sinking of the Japanese convoy in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea that March, all of these had bled the imperial military and pulled Japan back from the outer edge of her conquests. But she had not collapsed. She had contracted, consolidated, and dug in. At the center of Japanese power in the region was the great fortress port of Rabaul, on the northeastern tip of New Britain Island. Rabaul served as the nerve center for all Japanese military operations throughout the South Pacific, a harbor thick with warships, its skies crowded with fighter aircraft, its surrounding mountains honeyed with defensive positions. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had spent months designing a strategic campaign he called Operation Cartwheel, a 2-pronged hammer blow intended to isolate and ultimately neutralize Rabaul by pushing up through the Solomon Islands and along the northern coast of New Guinea simultaneously. The key to Operation Cartwheel, The hinge upon which the entire campaign swung was Bougainville, the largest of the Solomon Islands, heavily defended and strategically positioned. Before any Allied amphibious landing could be attempted on Bougainville's coast, the reefs that lined its bay had to be mapped. Thousands of landing craft would carry Marine and Army assault troops toward those beaches. If the maps were wrong, if a reef was missed, if a charted depth was inaccurate, those landing craft would be torn apart on the coral before the men inside them ever reached the shore. The photographs were not optional. They were the difference between a successful invasion and a massacre. For months, the mission had waited. Bad weather, mechanical failures, and the simple reality of the danger involved had turned it into an assignment that no crew in the 5th Air Force wanted to undertake. It required a single B-17 to fly 600 miles of open water, arrive over Bougainville's west coast at exactly the right altitude and the right light, and then hold absolutely straight and level for 22 unbroken minutes at 25,000 feet, perfectly still in the sky, a model for the camera's lens, while Japanese fighters rose from the airfields below to kill it. No fighter escort existed that could reach Bougainville from Allied territory. No rescue aircraft could follow. No second plane would fly alongside. The crew that took this mission would be alone in every sense of the word. The mission had hung for months, as Jay Ziemer later wrote, and nobody had been willing to take it. So, as had happened before in the long history of the 5th Air Force's most dangerous assignments, someone went down to see Jay Ziemer and his men. Jay Ziemer did not come from the expected mold of the celebrated American combat pilot. He had arrived in Australia in 1942 as a man nobody wanted in the cockpit. At the 22nd Bombardment Group, flying B-26 Martin Marauders, his landings had, in the words of fellow pilot Walt Krell, turned men's hair white. He checked out as a co-pilot only, could not seem to pass the qualification for the left seat, and was ultimately transferred to the 43rd Bombardment Group at Port Moresby in a kind of gentle exile, a pilot at large, assigned to no aircraft, assigned to no crew, filling in wherever a spare body was needed and no one better was available. And yet the people who flew with him described something difficult to reconcile with his failed Czech flights. They described a man of absolute stillness under fire, a man who, when Japanese anti-aircraft shells were bursting around the fuselage, seemed to find a particular clarity of thought that other men lost in those same moments. He had flown reconnaissance missions over Rabaul under a ceiling of Japanese fighters. He had dove to rooftop level over enemy harbor installations to get photographs no one else could obtain and had earned a Silver Star for it. He had shot out Japanese searchlights at 900 feet in a 4-engine heavy bomber while enemy gunners filled the sky around him. Walt Krell, who watched Ziemer across many months of the Pacific Air War, said it plainly. Whenever the 43rd got a real lousy mission, the worst possible mission of all, that nobody else wanted to fly, they went down to see Jay Ziemer and his gang. They couldn't keep them on the ground, no matter how bad or rough that mission might be. In the spring of 1943, Ziemer and a hand-picked crew had taken a wrecked and bullet-ridden B-17E from the boneyard at the end of the runway, a plane so shot up and stripped that other pilots cannibalized it for parts and rebuilt it from the engines outward. They fitted it with new Wright Cyclone engines. They stripped 2,000 pounds of unnecessary weight. They replaced the standard .30 caliber nose guns with heavier .50 caliber machine guns. They added twin .50s at the waist positions and an additional gun in the radio compartment. They wired a fixed .50 caliber gun directly through the lower nose and connected it to a trigger on the pilot's control yoke, so that Ziemer could fire like a fighter pilot from the cockpit. They laid loose spare machine guns on the catwalk for rapid replacement if one jammed under fire. When they were finished, Old 666 carried 16 active .50 caliber machine guns, and by some accounts, as many as 19 by the time they flew the Bougainville mission. No other flying fortress in the Southwest Pacific had anything close to that armament. Ziemer recruited his crew the same way he had rebuilt his airplane, from the bottom of the available pile. Men no other pilot wanted, men who had been labeled misfits and screw-offs and renegades by the officers of the 43rd. In this, there was a quiet and significant democracy. The men that institutional judgment had written off gathering around the pilot, that institutional judgment had nearly discarded, and together constructing something extraordinary from what the system had left behind. They called themselves the Eager Beavers. The bombardier was Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski, 28 years old, the eldest of the crew, the son of a Polish coal miner from Pennsylvania. He was the kind of man about whom it was later written that he never missed with either a bomb sight or a machine gun. He had been in the Pacific Theater for 18 months. He had already earned a Silver Star and an Air Medal. His orders sending him home to instruct new bombardier recruits in the United States had already been issued. His bags were packed. His departure was scheduled for June 19, 1943, 3 days away. He volunteered for the June 16th mission anyway. No one fully knows why. Perhaps it was impossible, after 18 months, to leave these men to a mission that would surely find them alone over the worst airspace in the Pacific. Perhaps he understood, in the particular way that experienced men understand such things, that old 666 needed him in the nose. Whatever the reason, Sarnowski was there when the aircraft lifted off from Port Moresby in the black hours before dawn. He had brought his rosary. At 25,000 feet over the Solomon Sea, the world was immense and blue and cold. Old 666 had been flying for 3 hours through the night when the first hint of equatorial dawn began to separate the ocean from the sky. The crew had not spoken much during the crossing. There was nothing to say that had not already been said in the moments before takeoff. Each man had his position. Each man knew the plan. George Kendrick, the photographer and waist gunner, had checked the camera equipment 3 times since departure. The vertical camera in the belly of the aircraft was the center of this mission. Everything else, the guns, the engines, the fuel, the crew themselves, existed in service of that one instrument. The camera was the reason they had crossed 600 miles of open water. The camera was the reason they were about to fly into the most dangerous piece of sky in the South Pacific. Arriving over the northwestern tip of Bougainville 30 minutes ahead of schedule, Ziemer found himself with time to kill. The sun had not risen high enough to light the coastline sufficiently for the infrared camera filters to operate correctly. He had a choice. He could orbit out over open water, out of sight, waiting in safety for the light to improve. Or he could fly the few minutes north to Buka Island, the small landmass separated from Bougainville by a thin strait of water, and complete the reconnaissance of the Japanese airfield there, which headquarters had requested, and which he had twice refused before takeoff. He put the decision to his crew. The answer came back from every position on the interphone with a common spirit, if not common words. These men trusted Ziemer without reservation. They had placed their survival in his hands on missions so dangerous that other crews had simply declined to fly them. Topside gunner Johnny Abel said it for all of them. We thought so much of Captain Ziemer and had such trust in his ability that we didn't give a damn where we went, just so long as he wanted to go there. Ziemer turned north. What his belly gunner, Forrest Dillman, saw through the plexiglass from 5 miles above Buka Island produced a cold and sudden dread. Parked wingtip to wingtip on the crushed coral runway and in the earthen revetments carved into the jungle, there were upward of 50 enemy aircraft. Pilots were already climbing into cockpits. The propellers of the Japanese Navy Model 22-0s were beginning to turn. Intelligence had not fully accounted for this. More than 400 Japanese fighter aircraft had been flown into Buka Airdrome the previous day. The 251 Kakatai, one of the Imperial Navy's most experienced fighter squadrons, repositioned from Rabaul to stage a major strike against Allied positions at Guadalcanal later that very morning. Old 666 had arrived over their staging base at the precise moment of their pre-mission preparations. Ziemer did not turn south. He did not run. He turned southeast, toward Bougainville. The camera was still running. The mapping had to be done that day, Ziemer wrote later. They had to know where the coral reefs were. A landing craft getting caught in a coral reef would result in the men getting blown out of the water before they could get overboard. He held old 666 straight and level at 25,000 feet over Empress Augusta Bay. And the camera clicked. What the Japanese pilots expected, as their Zeros climbed through the morning air in trail of the lone American bomber, was what they had every reason to expect. They had seen this before. A single American reconnaissance plane, caught over defended territory, would absorb the first attack and break for home. The pilot would dive, push his engines to maximum power, and run for the horizon. The mission would be aborted. The photographs would not be taken. The pilot who survived would file his report, and the episode would be recorded as an interdiction. A routine engagement. A lone aircraft against a full fighter squadron. The arithmetic was beyond dispute. They were flying Mitsubishi A6M0s, the finest carrier-based fighter the Imperial Navy had ever produced. In the early years of the Pacific War, the Zero had been virtually without peer in the theaters where it flew. Light, extraordinarily maneuverable, with a range that allowed it to operate over distances that baffled Allied planners. The Zero had served as the instrument of Japan's aerial dominance across 1,000 miles of Pacific airspace. The men who flew them in June 1943 were not inexperienced. The Tu-51 Kakutai had scored extensively against Allied aircraft in the skies over Rabaul and Guadalcanal. These were not fresh pilots. They rose from Buka in coordinated numbers, first 5, then more, and more still, until the testimony of old 660 SXS crew placed the total number of attacking aircraft somewhere between 17 and 20. Some accounts recorded 18. The B-17 with its 4 engines droning in the morning air became, from the perspective of the climbing Zeros, something easy, something already decided. There's a documented record in Japanese naval archives of that engagement. The men of the 251 Kakutai had expected a brief and efficient kill. What they found instead was something for which their training had not entirely prepared them. The first wave of attackers, 4 Zeros, and a twin-engine Nakajima J-1N fighter, coordinated their approach with precision. 2 came from the rear. 3 fanned across the front. It was a standard encirclement tactic designed to prevent the bomber from executing evasive turns. Zimmer, a veteran of many such attacks, recognized the formation and knew his standard defensive maneuver would expose his belly to the attackers at his front. He held course. In the nose of old 666, Bombardier Joe Sarnosky was already at his gun. The first 20mm cannon shell from a Zero punched through the plexiglass nose of the aircraft and exploded in the front compartment with a force that threw Sarnosky 15 feet backward and deposited him, face down, on the aluminum floor beneath the flight deck. The explosion tore a bowling ball-sized hole in his side. It lacerated his neck. It blasted plexiglass dust directly into his eyes. Navigator Ruby Johnston, also knocked from his feet, crawled to Sarnosky through the rushing Arctic wind that was now screaming through the shattered nose. Sarnosky told him not to worry. Then, with rivulets of blood already spreading across the floor and beginning to freeze in the cold air, Joe Sarnosky crab-walked back to his machine gun. He pulled himself upright against the weapon, and when the twin-engine fighter came in for a follow-up attack through the shattered nose, Sarnosky opened fire and drove it blazing from the sky. He kept firing until he could no longer hold himself upright. Then he collapsed beside his gun and closed his eyes. He was still breathing. A second 20mm shell had struck the instrument panel directly in front of Zimmer. It destroyed the panel. It severed the rudder cables. It blew away the left cockpit window. It drove shrapnel through Zimmer's left leg from calf to thigh. Thick, ugly sheaves of blackened flesh, like rashers of seared Canadian bacon, dangling from his exposed shin bone. As one historian later documented it, shrapnel had also torn through his right leg and both arms. A nicked artery in his left wrist sent a thin, rhythmic stream of blood pooling in his lap with every beat of his heart. His boots were filling with blood. His only working instruments were a manifold pressure gauge and a magnetic compass. He kept flying. The co-pilot, Lieutenant John Britton, had momentarily been knocked unconscious. When he came to, he found the communication system destroyed, the oxygen tanks ruptured and burning behind the cockpit, the flaps and brakes damaged. Britton and top turret gunner Johnny Abel extinguished the oxygen fire with their bare hands and rags of cloth. Radio operator William Vaughn, grazed in the neck by a Zero's round, bound the wound with a dirty rag, and returned to his station. Zimmer pushed old 666 into a dive to reach breathable air, descending from 25,000 feet to approximately 10,000, guiding a badly damaged aircraft by manifold pressure alone because his altimeter was hanging by its wires. The Japanese fighters followed him down. The battle continued for 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a span of time that, in ordinary life, carries no particular weight. It is the length of a morning meeting, the duration of a short drive, the time it takes to cook a meal. In the air over the Solomon Sea on June 16, 1943, in a shot-open bomber, with a dying man in the nose and a pilot bleeding from multiple wounds who refused to relinquish the controls, 40 minutes became something that stretched beyond any ordinary measure. Ziemer could not maneuver conventionally. He had no rudder pedals. He had no instrument panel. He steered Old 666 by adjusting engine power differentially, slowing the engines on one wing to turn the aircraft, with hands that were both wounded and slippery with his own blood. But he had, in those months of observing and studying and flying with the best combat pilots of the 5th Air Force, developed a deep understanding of the fighter attack pattern. When the Japanese pilots, now approaching from the front in single file, lining up for what they believed would be the final, fatal runs, made their approaches, Ziemer banked sharply inside their firing angles. His forward guns were gone, but the men at the rear positions, Kendrick at the waist, Pugh in the tail, Dillman in the ball turret, were firing without interruption, and as each Zero swept past, they were firing at it from below and behind, where it was vulnerable. One after another, the Zeros peeled away. The records held in the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records indicate that the 251 Kikutai, in the full engagement with a single, badly damaged American bomber, suffered one aircraft that ditched due to engine failure, and 3 more that returned to base with damage from defensive fire. The crew of Old 666 claimed 5 kills, a figure the Japanese records do not confirm, though the ferocity of the American defense was beyond any dispute. After 40 minutes and approximately 100 miles of running battle, the remaining Japanese fighters turned back. They were low on fuel. They were out of ammunition. The bomber they had meant to kill in the first few minutes of engagement was still flying. Still flying. In that moment of departure, the last Zero banking away and climbing back toward Buka, there remained aboard Old 666 a crew of 9 men, of whom 1 was dead, 4 were seriously wounded, and the pilot had lost nearly half the blood in his body. The camera in the belly of the aircraft had completed its run. The film was intact. George Kendrick had stowed it carefully even as the battle raged around him, even as the fuselage around him absorbed shell after shell and bullet after bullet. Old 666 had taken 5 20mm cannon hits and 187 individual bullet holes. By any standard of engineering or aviation, she should not have been flying. But the camera was safe. The photographs were safe. Radio operator William Vaughn, his neck wound rag-bound and seeping, activated an experimental naval radio set he had picked up before departure, an unconventional piece of equipment not standard issue on a B-17. In Morse code, with his good hand, he began to tap out their position. An American patrol vessel and Australian coast watchers picked up the signal and triangulated a course to Dobudura, an Allied airstrip on the northeastern coast of Papua, 90 miles from Port Moresby, well short of the Owen Stanley mountain range that Ziemer knew he could no longer clear. Britain pleaded with Ziemer to give up the controls, to let someone else fly, to lie down on the catwalk, and let the medical kit be opened before it was too late. Ziemer refused. "I don't move," he told Britain, "until the mission is ended." He flew 4 more hours. At 12:15 in the afternoon, more than 8 hours after takeoff, Old 666 cleared the coastal tree line at Dobudura and came in low over the grass strip. No flaps, no brakes, the landing gear extended, but the aircraft still moving far too fast. Britain had taken the controls in the final approach. He spun the wheel hard at the end of the runway, and the left wing dug into the earth, and the aircraft ground-looped to a stop in a cloud of red laterite dust at the far edge of the field. The engines went quiet. In the silence that followed, a ground crew medic working his way into the aircraft made his assessment of the cockpit and the bleeding, immobile figure in the pilot's seat. "Get the pilot last," the medic said. "He's dead." Jay Ziemer, still conscious at the edge of consciousness, heard the words. He could not find the strength to respond. 2 hands lifted him by the shoulders, and the pain returned so completely and so suddenly that the world went dark. At the field hospital at Dobudura, surgeons spent 72 hours removing nearly 150 pieces of shrapnel from Zimmer's body, including fragments of his own rudder pedals and shattered control cables that had been driven into his legs and torso by the cannon blast. He had lost nearly half the blood in his body. He would spend months in recovery. In the nose of the aircraft, tail gunner Herbert Pugh had found Sarnosky still breathing, had rolled him face up in his lap, and had pressed his rosary, the one Sarnosky always carried, into his hand. Sarnosky opened his eyes once. He lifted the rosary to his lips. He kissed it. Then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. Joseph Sarnosky died on the aluminum floor of Old 666. In the shattered nose he had defended to the last breath of his life, his final act of destruction of an enemy fighter that had tried to kill his brothers. He was 28 years old. His bags were still packed in the barracks at Port Moresby. Of the 9 men who flew that mission, 1 died, 4 seriously wounded. 3 walked away from the aircraft under their own power, and the crew as a whole, these men that the 43rd Bombardment Group had dismissed as screw-offs and misfits, this pilot that no one had wanted in a cockpit, this bombardier who had already been ordered home, became, and remained to this day, the most highly decorated combat aircrew in the history of the United States military. Captain J. Zimmer, Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The remaining 7 crew members, Britton, Vaughn, Pugh, Dillman, Abel, Johnston, and Kendrick, each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor in combat. No single combat aircrew in American history had before, or has since, accumulated a comparable constellation of decorations from a single mission. But the decoration is not the story. The decoration is only the echo of the story. The story is what happened in November 1943, when Allied amphibious forces executed the Bougainville landings and the Marines and Army soldiers of the assault waves came ashore on the west coast of Empress Augusta Bay. The story is in the landing craft that wove between the reefs, the exact positions of those reefs already charted, already mapped, already committed to paper. The story is in the men who did not die on Coral that morning because a camera in the belly of a shot-open bomber had kept running when it had every reason to stop. Military planners gave direct credit to the photographs taken by Old 666 for the success of those landings. Tens of thousands of lives had been part of the calculation that J. Zimmer made when, bleeding and instrument blind, he kept his aircraft straight and level over Empress Augusta Bay and refused to turn away. There is a particular transformation that happens to an adversary who has assumed the outcome of a fight before the fight has begun. The pilots of the 251 Kikutai had climbed into their Zeros on the morning of June 16, 1943, believing that the bomber above them was already dead. It was, from every rational perspective, a reasonable belief. A single reconnaissance B-17, caught in the open at altitude over defended territory, without fighter escort, against a full fighter squadron of experienced pilots. The mathematics of air combat were not ambiguous. The bomber should have run, or died, or both. What the Japanese pilots encountered instead was an aircraft that had been prepared specifically for this eventuality, rebuilt from wreckage to fight, armed beyond any bomber they had encountered, crewed by men who had individually chosen to be there and who understood with perfect clarity that the choice to hold their course was not a choice made in ignorance. It was a choice made in full knowledge of what it would cost. The Japanese records confirmed the confusion in the engagement. The fighters made pass after pass. The bomber bled but did not fall. The crew fired until guns burned out, and then replaced the guns from the spares on the catwalk. The man who was supposed to be dead at his machine gun kept firing until he could no longer hold himself upright. The pilot who had lost nearly half his blood held the control wheel with his fingertips rather than surrender it. The aircraft that 520mm shells and 187 bullets could not bring down flew for more hours over open ocean and landed in a cloud of dust at the edge of an Allied airstrip. The ideology of empire, the belief that the calculus of force is simple, that weight of numbers resolves every contest cleanly, found, on that morning over the Solomon Sea, its limitation. It found the place where the arithmetic runs out. What does a camera mean, held inside a bomber. In the grand machinery of the Second World War, the tanks and ships and artillery pieces, the strategic calculations and the logistical chains that sustained millions of men across millions of miles of conflict, a camera seems a modest thing. A lens and a shutter, a strip of film wound carefully in its housing. It records what is below. It does not judge or destroy. It only sees. But the camera in the belly of Old 666 was, on June 16, 1943, the most important object in the Southwest Pacific. It was the reason the mission existed. It was the reason Joe Sarnosky had declined to go home. It was the reason Jay Zimmer held his aircraft straight and level at 25,000 feet over an enemy airfield from which fighters were already rising to kill him. It was the reason that, after 40 minutes of combat and 4 hours of wounded flight, George Kendrick had protected that film with his life and stowed it safely before the aircraft ground to a stop at Dobodura. The camera was the promise that those men made to the 37,000 soldiers and Marines who would later climb into landing craft and push toward a coral-ringed shore in the dark. The camera was the covenant that someone had gone ahead into the worst of it and brought back the truth of what was there. It clicked steadily through the whole of the mission, through the first pass of the Zeros, through the cannon blasts and the shattering of the nose, through the dying of Joe Sarnosky and the bleeding of Jay Zimmer, through 40 minutes of fighter attack and 4 hours of impossible flight. The film survived when men did not. The photographs saved lives that their takers never knew. That is what a camera can mean when it is carried by people who understand what it is for. Years later, in a quiet interview, Jay Zimmer was asked to describe what he had thought about during those final hours over the ocean, bleeding, instrument blind, his aircraft full of wounded men and one man already dead, with 500 miles of sharp water below him and no certainty of survival. He said that he thought about getting the film home. He did not speak about glory. He did not speak about medals. He did not speak about ideology or the great abstraction of the war's purpose. He spoke about the photographs. He spoke about the landing craft. He spoke about the men who would come ashore on those beaches and who needed to know where the reefs were. That, perhaps, is the most important thing about Captain Jay Zimmer Jr. and the crew of Old 666. They did not perform their act of extraordinary valor because they believed themselves to be extraordinary. They performed it because the mission required it, because the men at the other end of those photographs required it, and because in the community that had formed itself around that battered, rebuilt, overarmed bomber, the community of cast-offs and volunteers and misfits, the idea of leaving a thing unfinished had simply ceased to be an option. They had built Old 666 from wreckage. They had armed her against every contingency. They had taken, in that aircraft, every mission that anyone else had declined. They had become, in the process, the crew that no assignment could refuse, that no danger could redirect. The camera clicked. The film came home. And in November 1943, when the Marines waded ashore on the coast of Bougainville and the landing craft moved safely between the reefs that had been mapped on a June morning by a bomber that should have been dead, the full weight of what had happened over the Solomon Sea was quietly, permanently, written into the record of the war. Joe Sarnosky was buried in the Pacific. He was 28 years old. He had wanted to sink 5 enemy ships before going home. He had written that he would be ashamed to return to the States if he didn't. In the end, he remained in the theater of the war he had come to fight, not because anyone required it of him, but because he could not conceive of doing otherwise. There's a photograph of the Eager Beavers, taken before the June 16th mission. 8 men. Sergeant Vaughn, Sergeant Kendrick, Sergeant Abel, Sergeant Pugh standing in the front row. Behind them, Jay Zimmer in the center, wide-grinned and relaxed, with Joe Sarnosky at his right. They are wearing flight clothes. They are squinting in the equatorial light. They look, in the photograph, like men who know exactly what they are about to do. Old 666 was repaired after the Bougainville mission, returned to service, and eventually shipped back to the United States, where it served as a training aircraft. In August 1945, 2 months after the war in the Pacific ended, the aircraft was flown to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and sold for scrap. The aluminum was melted down. The engines were parted out. The fuselage that had absorbed 5 20mm shells and 187 bullet holes, and still flown 400 miles, with a dying crew, was reduced to its component materials and dispersed. The camera is gone. The film is archived. The maps it produced are housed in the record of the United States military. The reefs of Empress Augusta Bay are still there, beneath the Pacific water, where they have always been. The landing craft that navigated them successfully in November 1943 are long since scrapped as well. The men who rowed them ashore have mostly gone, but the fact of what happened holds undiminished. 1 bomber, 18 fighters, a camera that would not stop running, a bombardier who returned to his gun after a cannon shell had already killed him, a pilot who would not relinquish the controls while there remained anything left to protect, a crew of men that the system had written off, who wrote themselves, in the fullest possible measure, back in. This is what free men do when they are given a worthy thing to carry. They carry it home,